Good evening, Mr. Bond fans, and welcome once again. If you recall a few reviews ago, I opened up my Live and Let Die review by talking about how that film was something of a saviour for the James Bond film franchise, and how there were around about 3 times in the series history where it really needed that key film, otherwise it kind of might have just disappeared forever. Well, a couple of films after Live and Let Die, and they were in need of another saviour. The Man with the Golden Gun was something of a critical and commercial flop when compared to the other Bond films, and it's kinda easy to see why. I know that the film has its fans, and I'm quite partial to it myself, to be honest, but it's undoubtedly a mess of a story, so it feels right that they took a little longer, an unheard of 3 years at that time, before they released the next Bond film. These days, just the idea of waiting just 3 years for a new Bond film is something of a pipe dream. However, those 3 years were largely spent in legal disputes and changing the guard. Harry Saltzman, who had co-produced the movie since the start, was forced to sell his share of the Bond film franchise, so here we just have Albert R. Broccoli as sole producer. There was also a shake-up of the creative team that had worked somewhat consistently throughout the previous 3 films. Director Guy Hamilton was out, and Lewis Gilbert returned to the series, bringing with him a grandiose scale and decadence that actually feels somewhat jarring when compared to the last few, more lower-key entries. But was this instinct right? Did the returning and new blood breathe some fresh life into this series? Of course it did. This is one of the greatest Bond films ever made, but is it a success across the board completely, and does it still hold up today? Well, that's what we're going to be looking at as we dive right into The Spy Who Loved Me. As soon as the film begins, we get a newly filmed Roger Moore gun barrel sequence, and a couple of major changes from the previous 2 movies up front. Firstly, we have a proper widescreen aspect ratio now, and we also get a guitar twanging version of the Bond theme as Moore shoots the camera. This is notable, as the series' most regular composer up to this point, John Barry, made a very definitive distinction between Bonds. Connery got the guitar twangs, Roger Moore did not, so immediately we're starting this Roger Moore adventure with a different sound. The aspect ratio is around 2.35 to 1, and personally it's a relief that the series switched back to a wider screen format and kept it this way. I mentioned in my previous reviews that Live and Let Die and The Man with the Golden Gun, while each having their own visual merits, end up looking decidedly more television, and a good proper widescreen image is just by its very nature cinematic, and Bond films should always look and feel like they were made for the big screen, so it's a welcome return here. Anyway, enough of the technicalities and onto the plot. The pre-title sequence here begins by showing us a rather routine day on a British naval sub featuring chess and boobs galore. This may seem like a rather trivial point to get hung up on, but it is the most explicit nudity we see in a Bond film outside of the main title sequence at this point, and I kind of like that it's just hanging there in the environment. The camera doesn't like zoom in on it, it's not a focus of anything, but it just helps to make the environment feel lived in. I buy that these guys would just casually have porn hanging up on their walls. Just as this guy gate crashes a pair of chess players, things start to wobble, so you know there's danger afoot, and then boom, we're straight into people reacting to the disappearance of the submarine. It's quite a tense and exciting opening stinger to the film, and while we don't find out details here exactly, we do get various baffled officials reacting to the news, including George Baker, who I guess had a career change after working at the College of Arms a few films ago. We also see that the Russians have lost a nuclear submarine as well, through some incredibly expositional dialogue.
Submarine Potemkin disappeared without trace?
What's that, Skip? There's a plan to radiate the gold in Fort Knox? We'll talk more about this guy later on, but this is General Gogol, and this is his first appearance in the series. Here we see him quickly scrambling his best operative, Agent XXX, to investigate the disappearance of the sub. There's a bit of a red herring type of thing here, where we're led to believe that Agent XXX is actually the very Bond-looking and incredibly hairy Michael Billington, but instead it's Barbara Bach's Anya Amasova. But again, we'll talk more about her later on, as the pair say quick goodbyes and go off to their individual missions. Eventually, we get onto a familiar face, as Bernard Lee's M is called on to notify his best agent too that there is trouble afoot, which leads us into Roger Moore, looking like he's sucking the life force out of poor Susie Vanna here. Anyway, he receives the message that he must, as M puts it, pull out.
But James, I need you.
So does England.
This leads us into the main action sequence of the pre-title sequence, a ski chase between the horrifically unsuitably dressed Bond and similarly ill-attired Russians. Yellow and black ski suits, really, with red highlights too. I mean, it's hardly subtle, but that doesn't matter because, if they wore white, obviously they would be well camouflaged, but they wouldn't pop on the screen as much, and the skiing here is stunning, and the icy mountains are beautiful, so I guess it's a way of telling the audience that, hey, look, if you're looking for realism, check your expectations at the door. This is not that film. More so than even Goldfinger, I think that The Spy Who Loved Me had the greatest impact on what audiences would come to expect from James Bond pre-title sequences. Prior to this, I'd say that only really Thunderball had a pre-title sequence featuring a standout jaw-dropping stunt. Enough of them featured Bond getting into fistfights, but equally they were just happy with providing a bit of scene-setting intrigue. I mean, heck, out of the previous 8 pre-title sequences, almost half of them don't even feature Bond himself, and a couple of them have next to nothing to do with the story that eventually unfolds throughout the rest of the film. The Spy Who Loved Me proves that you can, in fact, have your cake and eat it too. It gets you involved in the main plot whilst also providing some truly exceptional action. Despite some dodgy rear projection shots of Moore here, it's a fantastic opening to the film, and obviously it culminates in one of the most impressive stunts in the entire series. At this point, Bond had been off the screen for 3 years, and a lot was riding on this film to ensure the franchise's continued success. The Union Jack opening and the Bond theme blaring reportedly received applause at the premiere, and it's easy to see why. It's a kick-ass climax to a really great sequence, and then follow that up with one of the very best songs of the series, with Nobody Does It Better by Carly Simon, paired with, for my money, the best Maurice Binder title sequence of the series. Then yes, you have the audience in the palm of your hand in the first 10 minutes of the movie. Interestingly, this is the first title sequence to actually feature a James Bond actor in it, and I think that's entirely appropriate. Bond had been off the screen for 3 years, so at this point they want to get Bond on the screen as much as possible, especially as a lot of the opening scenes of this film are going to be a lot of other characters delivering exposition. Get Bond up on that screen as much as possible. Speaking of story, back to General Gogol as he informs Agent XXX that her partner was killed on his mission. At this point, she doesn't know that it was in fact Bond that killed her lover, but this obviously creates great tension for the rest of the film when the two agents are eventually paired together. It also gives an emotional bent to the story early on, which pairs well with the actual plot of the subs going missing. Overall, great setup to the film. Meanwhile, Bond in full naval gear attends a meeting to discuss the missing British sub. There's a whole load of new folks in this room here, including from here on recurring figure Geoffrey Keane as Minister of Defence Frederick Grey, and Robert Brown as Admiral Hargreaves, and, who are you?
Captain Forsyth.
Commander, sir.
Commander Bond, sir.
Ah, yes, Captain Forsyth. I'm so glad we took the time to name-check someone who never actually has anything to do in the scene, but you know what, it is great to have Q in here as well, amongst everyone else, to provide some familiarity.
Commander, this tracing means that the Russians can track our nuclear submarines underwater and sink them.
I believe it does.
Well, how could they track them? It's impossible.
No, it's quite simple, really.
I love the fact that Q just bursts his way into this conversation. In fact, I think we should have more just random entries by Q into the series, Jesus. The gist of the meeting is that they all figure out the British subs are being tracked, and this is obviously bad news for the Minister of Defence, with whom Bond seems to be on relatively informal naming terms.
Where, in fact, did we get the tracing, Freddy?
Minister of Defence Frederick Grey to you. Bond is told to head to Cairo to trace the plans for the submarine tracking system before we shift to a sequence that sets up the main villain of the film, Kurt Jürgens as Karl Stromberg, partaking in such villainous activities as murdering scientists and feeding his assistant to his pet shark, all while listening to some classical music. It turns out that the assistant leaked Stromberg's plans for the sub tracking system, which of course set Bond on his mission, so down the chute she goes. I do love how Stromberg ends up killing the scientists too, but for some reason he doesn't feed them to the shark. Instead, he decides to blow them up in a helicopter instead. Maybe he just doesn't want his pet getting fat. Is obesity a problem for sharks? If the presence of a shark wasn't enough, we're introduced to fan-favourite iconic henchman Jaws here, played by Richard Kiel, so we need look no further for an explanation as to why this particular villain has an obsession with water and marine predators than Steven Spielberg's box office juggernaut Jaws, which is clearly some kind of influence here, as Lord knows this story bears no resemblance at all to Ian Fleming's story of the same name. It's quite surprising that they could even get away with calling the character Jaws. He's semi-based on a henchman called Horror from the Ian Fleming story, so they could have just called him Horror. Horror is a perfectly acceptable name for a Bond villain, but no, instead they had to name him after one of the most profitable movies of all time. On a completely separate and unrelated note, I can't wait to see how the new henchman Avengers Endgame does in No Time to Die. Whatever I may say about Stromberg later on, I think this sequence as an introduction works really well. The grand room, the shark, the cold murders of his former staff, seeing his base of operations rise from the sea like it does, it's all really great stuff. Then we're off to Egypt to rejoin James Bond in the first in a series of links in a chain he's following to find the microfilm containing the submarine tracking plans. Not sure if this is the most economical storytelling. We're being introduced to a lot of characters and hearing a lot of names, but it's Bond doing good spy work, and Cairo is a fabulous setting. Moore is looking and acting great, so right now I'm just happy to be here. He's sent to the home of a man named Fakesh, where another of Stromberg's henchmen, Sandor, is sent to kill him. There's also this lady who provides us with a curious moment. She's there to distract Bond, clearly, but for some reason when she sees Sandor with the gun, she does this.
No!
As it plays out in the film, it's kind of vague on exactly what is happening here. I mean, why does she scream out no? Was she not in on this plan to kill Bond? And when she sees Sandor, does she think that, oh, well, if he shoots Bond, the bullet's gonna get me? And then the awkward turn. For the longest time, I never quite understood if Bond was using her as a human shield, like Fiona in Thunderball, or if she was just sacrificing herself for him. It's really, even in the Christopher Wood novelization, it's quite vague. So I guess it's kind of open to interpretation what happens here. I think we're just supposed to believe that it is accidental, that Sandor was supposed to shoot Bond and he ends up shooting the woman instead as she's panicking. Or has she just fainted from the tension? It's a curious moment anyway, and one of those kind of lazy plot points you occasionally find in Bond films. But anyway, onto the bed she goes, and Bond fights with Sandor on the rooftop. Love all the locals assembling to watch the scene on their balconies, by the way. And we get one of the more badass Roger Moore moments in the series as he coldly allows Sandor to fall from the building after acquiring a key bit of information from him, which eventually leads him to Mr. Fakesh, enjoying a light show at the Pyramids of Giza along with Anya. This prompts a surprisingly suspenseful and eerie sequence, which sets up Jaws as a menacing and downright creepy villain as he uses his metal teeth to kill Fakesh. It's quite a tonally jarring moment, all things considered. Bond films don't normally feature such ominous scenes, and I could imagine little kids actually being kind of freaked out by this. Jaws is really quite intimidating. For now. Bond is too late to save Fakesh, but does learn the location of the next person in the chain from his diary. But before he's able to head back to his hotel, he's set upon by a couple of Russian goons. Anya has some entourage with her at this light show, I guess? Or are these just overly pepped up pyramid security guards? Either way, in the novelization, this sequence is replaced by Bond being tortured by some Russian goons. And the method of torture, they clamp some electrodes to his scrotum and electrocute him through his balls. And I think we can all agree it's a crime against cinema that we never got to see Roger Moore performing that on the big screen. I'll get into more about the Russian presence in this film later on, but suffice to say, for the film's benefit, it is better that the scene plays out the way it does here rather than in the book. A bit of rough and tumble rather than full-on torture. Anyway, on to the next scene where Bond heads to meet with Max Kalber, who supposedly has the coveted microfilm. By the way, I know that the sweeping guy extra from Quantum of Solace gets a lot of flack as the worst background artiste in all of Bond, but these guys must surely come a close second. I love how they're clearly just standing there waiting for their cue to start walking. Anya quickly joins Bond at the bar, and we have one of the best scenes in the film as the pair attempt a little bit of one-upmanship, with Anya making a fleeting reference to Bond's deceased wife.
Many lady friends, but married only once. Wife killed.
All right, you've made your point.
This is obviously significant, as it's the first time since Majesty's Secret Service that the series has really acknowledged that Bond was married, and I'm glad that they made a deliberate moment of continuity here, linking Bonds together, but also I love how Moore plays this moment. He's okay with her reading him, and he's taking it on the chin. He's even okay with Anya mentioning his wife, but as soon as she's about to go into the details of the events of her death, a nerve is clearly touched. He cuts her off and stares her down. Anya's reaction is really nice here too. She wasn't expecting to ruffle his feathers so much, and I like that we don't linger too long on the moment before Bond is making snide remarks, and he's even quite cutting when he leaves her here.
Goodbye, Mr. Bond.
Well, let's say au revoir. I have the oddest feeling we'll be meeting again sometime.
I like like how Roger's playing his early scenes with Anya. Oftentimes we see when Roger Moore's Bond gets into a situation with a woman, he just sort of charms her into submission. But here the relationship between the two is quite barbed and prickly, and I like that they're playing up the rivalry. Anyway, on with the plot. Bond and Anya both meet with Max Calber, and a bidding war is about to start between the two nations before Mr. Calber is called away to the telephone. And again, Jaws provides us with another really quite tense, like almost slasher movie moment. I mean, the quick cuts, how much of it happens behind the telephone box screen, Max Calber's terrified face, the ramping up of the music. Jaws doesn't need a hockey mask and a machete. The filmmaking really does well to make him a genuinely unsettling presence. For now. Bond comes across Calber, but the microfilm is gone, so he instinctively pursues the 8-foot-tall telecoms worker and is quickly joined by Anya as the two continue their one-upmanship in the back of Jaws' van. It becomes apparent that they both seem to be aware that the guy that they're following is Jaws, and I love how he actually grins when he overhears that they actually know who he is.
You don't know who he is. He's on our records a professional killer.
Called Jaws?
There's a montage of the truck travelling over the desert, and we get the first hint here that Bond may actually be kinda into Anya as she falls asleep on his shoulder. This little comedy bit strikes me as something that maybe wasn't scripted, but came about as the actors goofed around, or just like an on-set ad-lib. I would buy it if Bond thought that Anya had fallen asleep on his shoulder on purpose, but Moore's clearly playing it like, oh, maybe I'll just turn on the old charm license here and put my arm... Oh, wait, what? I wasn't doing anything. What? What? In the novelization, she does just fall asleep on him accidentally, and it's during the next sequence where Bond starts getting himself into a tizzy about how hot she is, but damn, she's a communist, what's an agent to do? In the film, the segue into Bond starting to fancy her is less convincing. It's a necessary beat for the drama that comes later on that the two start falling for each other, but given all of the prickliness, I don't know how just sort of one night in the back of a van together really inspires these kinds of horny feelings. Jaws pulls up at some ruins, and there's another really cool sequence here as Bond and Anya stalk around looking for the villain. There's a Jaws shot here that just gives me the absolute creeps, and I don't know if it's the music or his sort of like hobbled walk or what, but oof, this particular shot really does give me the creeps. All of the stuff of Bond and Anya moving around the place is really great too, and there are so many lovely shots in here. Generally, I think along with the other Lewis Gilbert-directed Bond films, this is one of the most beautifully photographed Bond movies of them all. The widescreen with this particular film stock is just gorgeous. I adore the look of this film. There's a good fight scene here with Jaws in which Anya makes off with the microfilm. Jaws is buried under some rubble, and Bond makes one of my favourite quips of the film.
Egyptian builders.
I think I like it that bit more because of how Roger delivers it. Like, the look on his face reads like he thinks of the quip in his mind, kind of amuses himself thinking about it, has to shrug off that there's no one around to hear it, and then just kind of thinks it's so good that he has to say it out loud anyway. His overconfidence is also funny considering how unbeatable Jaws ends up being and how Bond thinks that just a bit of scaffolding would do the trick here. There's some more nice back and forth between Bond and Anya before things get strangely silly for the moment and undo pretty much all of the tense build-up of Jaws so far. Bond and Anya are in the van, and Bond is being all lackadaisical and making pithy remark after pithy remark and seems completely unfazed by Jaws ripping the vehicle apart while they sit inside with his bare hands.
Try the big one. Can you play any other tune? Let's try reverse, that's backwards. Would you like me to try it? Women drivers.
Quiet.
I think if they'd have taken out about half of his lines, the scene would maybe have worked as something a little bit more tense. It's a horrifying concept that the man is so strong, he's ripping a vehicle to shreds, and once he gets you, he's going to kill you. But I think that Moore's performance during this scene, while enjoyable as always, feels a little tonally out of place compared with much of the rest of the film that we've experienced so far, I think. The cherry on top of the very silly cake, of course, is Jaws dropping a stone on his foot and doing a comedic take. I'm not saying I dislike the way that the scene is played, but it's just kind of jarring to go from one scene where Jaws is this terrifying force of nature to being the butt of the joke in the next scene. Anyway, Bond and Anya head off and chug across the desert to some music that... doesn't feel entirely right for a Bond film, and then they must continue on music to more music that is not entirely fitting for a Bond film. The theme from Lawrence of Arabia. So this particular music gag was something that was cooked up in the editing room to amuse the crew, and it just ended up staying in the film. I don't know if it's aged particularly well, and it certainly feels out of character for a Bond film to be making an overt reference to another popular movie, but it's over quick enough, I suppose, and then it's up to Bond and Anya to hitch a boat ride to Cairo. By the way, they spent an entire day travelling across the desert to find this place. When they woke up by the ruins, it was just morning, and now it's sundown, and Bond still has his top button and bow tie done. Like, that is a man who compromises nothing in the art of looking good. Bond takes a moment to examine the microfilm himself before putting the moves on Anya, and she does indeed blow him off, just not in the way that he'd intended or liked. Here's probably a good point for me to talk about Barbara Bach's performance as Anya Amasova. I really love this character and her role in this film. Pairing up Bond with a female counterpart from the East is such a great concept, and I'm actually surprised it took them 10 films to get to this point. It just seems like such a great obvious thing in hindsight, and I think that Barbara Bach plays the part well. However, I think her overall performance suffers from the voice looping she clearly had to do much of for the film. I think she emotes well facially, and her instincts are really right, and yet her voice is just so flat and monotone for the most part, which is a real shame. Maybe they should have just called up Bond girl voice veteran Nikki Vandersel to dub the part like she did with Honey Rider and Dr. No. It's certainly not uncommon for films, especially of that era, to not use the on-set recordings but instead loop the actor's dialogue later on, but some adjust to this practice more than others, and I don't think that Barbara Bach does all that well. That being said, I still think she has a fantastic chemistry with Roger Moore that retains a necessary coolness and prickliness, particularly in these early scenes. By the way, while we're on this scene, I love this moment when Anya takes hold of Bond's hand and moves it down her body, and he's all like, "Is that going where I think it's going?" Before she eventually settles it on her thigh, and then he's all, "Oh well, try again." Anyway, Anya knocks Bond out, and when he wakes up, it's the next day, and Anya and the microfilm are nowhere to be seen. Love all this stuff with Bond waking up and putting together the pieces of what happened, together with all these lovely shots of people just going about their daily lives in this part of the world. I think that Bond of the 60s and 70s does the travelogue stuff better than any other era of the series, and this is no exception, including when Bond must venture into more Egyptian ruins to find an MI6 pop-up. There's a blink and you'll miss it scene with Moneypenny here. I feel really bad for the character in both this and the next film, Moonraker. She gets no close-ups, no flirty banter with Bond, and that's a shame. She doesn't even have an excuse to stand up, but the look of delight on her face as Bond enters the room is quite lovely. One of my favourite moments of the film occurs here. Bond enters expecting to find M behind the desk, and instead it's Russian General Gogol, and Bond just kind of slowly prowls the edge of the room a bit while the two lock eyes. There's no words exchanged between them. It's such a great moment. I don't know what's supposed to be going through Bond's mind in this moment, whether he's working out if he's just stepped into a trap or if he's just wondering why Moneypenny is doubling up her duties, but I think the two men just staring each other out is really cool and really ominous. But this is over very quickly as Anya and M enter the scene, and it becomes very clear that there is a truce of some kind going on between the UK and Soviet governments. This is a pretty big deal, particularly for audiences who might have been more used to the Fleming way of handling Anglo-Soviet relations, which is to say that if you're on the Soviet side of that, there's around a 99% chance that you are in fact evil. Even in the Christopher Wood novelization, the Russian presence in the story is more antagonistic. General Gogol isn't even in the book, and instead it's Colonel General Nikitin as the head of Smersh, and he's horrible. The scene from earlier on where Gogol is telling Anya that her lover has died, Walt Gotell, the actor that plays Gogol, plays that scene with real sincerity. He's genuinely upset for this poor woman, and that scene does well to humanize these Russian characters, which was not a common thing to expect from a Bond movie of this era. In the book, Nikitin is slimy, and he's coming on to Anya when he's telling her this bad news, and similarly, the fight outside the Giza pyramids earlier on in the film, it's a slight scuffle, and Bond just kind of adjusts his tie and moves along. No hard feelings, chaps, better luck next time sort of thing. In the book, it's a proper torture sequence, which obviously makes the Russians much more antagonistic. I think the tone of the relationship is just right, though, and I like that Gogol isn't just a completely unpleasant arse. Both nations are presented as kind of two sides of the same coin here, and I think that's good. Anyway, off for some fun in Q's lab. I think this film also perfects the whole Q scene setup. In the past, we've had Q lab scenes where we see gadgets that aren't intended for Bond's adventure, and these have been fun, but really those moments are quite few and far between in the first 9 films. Here we get a lovely assortment of fun things and a lively performance from Desmond Llewellyn.
I want that ready for Ahmed's tea party.
There's a really odd shot in here, though, of Emin Gogol just being polite.
After you, Alexis.
Oh, no, after you, Miles.
Oh, thank you.
Obviously, it's notable because we get to know that M's first name is Miles, just like the character from the Ian Fleming works. But it's just such an odd moment. I guess it's nice to see the two heads of the services being courteous with each other, but M just holds everyone else up by making this statement. But, you know, Miles, eh? The group assemble to look at the contents in the microfilm with Q when they come across one particular detail which prompts an odd line from Q.
Looks a bit like a bishop's mitre.
It's such an obscure thing to reference, but I do kind of like the idea of a Bond film where a bishop is the main villain.
Do you expect me to talk? No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to...
Mass! Anya is clearly much more in the know as she identifies the image as an obscured logo for the Stromberg shipping line. There's a little back and forth between Bond and Anya which prompts a heartfelt and genuine compliment from M.
Well done, James.
This is in stark contrast with the previous couple of films where Bernard Lee's portrayal as M could best be described as... what's the word I'm looking for?
Of all the fouled-up, half-witted operation. I almost wish that Scaramanga had a contract on you. Shut up.
Christie? From this point onwards, M in the Roger Moore series is kind of more of a softer figure, here with Bernard Lee and then later on with Robert Brown. And with Bernard Lee, I guess it kind of makes sense. I mean, he did seem to age quite a lot in the 3 years between The Man with the Golden Gun and this, so I guess it's kind of appropriate that his role is a little bit more softer and more paternal here, as much as I do enjoy scenes where M and Bond are trading barbs with each other. Bond and Anya are paired together formally for the investigation here, and I love how they both smirk at each other. Even Anya now is like, this is gonna be fun. Anyway, off to Sardinia to investigate Stromberg, and the pair do some genuine bonding here, and it's lovely stuff. I think these two have some really great chemistry. They're clearly horny AF for each other. Bond even ordered some champagne and charged it to the company, as he puts it, meaning us, the British taxpayers. Hey, mate, I pay enough chuffing tax, never mind subsidising the... But, Jaws appears for a little fight aboard the train. I know from behind-the-scenes material that there was some hesitance by including this sequence all, given that Roger had a train fight with a henchman just a couple of films ago, and of course comparisons are always going to be made to the famous From Russia With Love fight sequence, but this between Jaws and Bond I really love. In a rare moment for Moore's Bond, he looks genuinely petrified and is clearly not having an easy time fighting this henchman. Anya is disappointingly knocked out early on. I mean, these two are supposed to be opposite numbers, and Anya is supposed to be an accomplished agent in her own right, so I would have liked to have seen her more involved in the fight with Bond, see the two of them team up against this henchman. But nonetheless, Jaws is dispatched of, so Bond and Anya can finally succumb to their carnal yearnings and get it on. Next up, we see the pair arriving in Sardinia to meet up with Q, who provides Bond with his latest vehicle for this mission, and in a nice shake-up from previous installments that usually have the audience privy to the details as Q is explaining things to Bond, here, along with Anya, we, the audience, can only guess what's being said. This is really nice, as it means we're surprised later on when we get to the action sequences and we see all the gadgets come out of the car. However, now that the Lotus has the reputation as being the underwater car, and even at the time when it was using all the promotional material, I'm not sure if anyone has ever been surprised by what happens in the film, but still, it's a nice concept all the same. Small thing, I like that Anya refers to Q by his actual name here.
Good morning, Major Boothroyd.
Morning, Major.
It's another nice bit of continuity along with the M. Miles thing, and a nice reference back to Fleming in a film that, by Fleming's own request, has next to nothing to do with the source material. The pair drive off to their hotel to be greeted by the horniest receptionist in the entire Bond series, and that's saying something. The absolute look of delight on her face when she realises that Bond and Anya have a suite booked with 2 bedrooms is something else. She's all like, well, hey, might actually have a look in here. Glad I wore my good underwear. Our heroes are granted an audience with Carl Stromberg under the disguises of a visiting marine biologist and his wife. Arriving to take the pair for their visit is Naomi, from whom it is clear that Stromberg takes a very lax attitude towards work attire for his staff. I just love Bond's reaction when he sees her. He even turns back to Anya as if to say, "Can you believe this shit?" There's a little jealousy going on from Anya, which is cute, and Bond's playing up to it, which is nice, and I really like the music as the boat is approaching Stromberg's Atlantis, and I even really like Stromberg's disembodied floating head here watching over Atlantis like the Wizard of Oz. But seriously, some great model work, matte paintings and such for the time here, very impressive stuff. Bond meets with Stromberg for the routine hero and villain meet for a civil conversation scene, with Bond noticing the severed hand of the lady that got eaten by the shark earlier on just before Stromberg arrives, which is a really nice touch. There's a detail here about Stromberg. Just before Bond meets with him, Naomi tells him not to shake his hand, as he doesn't like it. Bond, being the anarchist world burner that he is, though, obviously goes in for the handshake, which Stromberg, of course, refuses. It might seem like a bit of an odd detail, unless you were paying attention earlier on. You can see earlier on in the film that Stromberg has webbed hands, and he's obviously quite sensitive about it, and it's certainly not uncommon for Bond villains to have some kind of physical abnormality, and for a villain obsessed with water, having webbed hands feels entirely appropriate. However, it never really factors into anything, and it's so inconsequential that I'd be surprised if most first-time viewers of the film even pick up on this. Bond's audience with Stromberg is short, just long enough for the villain to pontificate and insult some of his own marine life, bizarrely.
There's ugliness.
You're no prize pig yourself, Buster.
Then he takes Bond to show off his underwater city model and goes all swivel-eyed when Bond suggests that such a city could never be a reality.
We all have our dreams.
No dream, Mr. Sterling. Soon a reality.
What a mental thing to say. Bond must rejoin Anya and Naomi, who are suddenly really getting on for some reason. Did we miss something? Or did they just find out they both have a shared passion for models of suspicious supertankers? They seem to be really bonding over this one anyway. Jaws identifies Bond and Anya as the agents that he met on the train, and Stromberg, eating what seems to be fish food, which is just so weird and awesome, he instructs for them both to be killed, which prompts one of the very best vehicle chases in the entire series.
You ever got the feeling somebody doesn't like you?
The Lotus Esprit is attacked in turn by a motorbike, a car with Jaws and some goons in, a helicopter piloted by Naomi, and finally by wet-suited frogmen. I love how this sequence builds and builds, and it features some fantastic stunt work and just little moments, and I love that just when you think it might all be over, another assault appears. There's some surprisingly fluid action in some places as well, and so many, just like I say, just little bits that work so well. Like, the choreography on this guy in the back seat and Jaws grabbing his gun from him is really well timed and done and performed, and don't get me started on how impressive the helicopter stuff is here. This thing can turn on a dime, and oh, this shot, oh, I just adore this shot so much, and the following looks of recognition between Bond and Naomi are just so perfectly performed and timed. It's wonderful. I genuinely get goosebumps during this scene, it's that good. The main showcase, of course, being that the Lotus can convert into a mini sub, thus sealing its fate as one of the most iconic of all the Bond vehicles. It's such a perfect design for such a feature too, like naturally the Lotus just looks like it was built to work underwater. I know that I have a history on this channel of expressing strong dislike of underwater action sequences. By their nature, everything has to slow down and come to a near standstill, and yeah, I think this film handles underwater action probably better than any other Bond film. The editing works really well, and I don't feel like the pace drops to a halt like I do with scenes from Thunderball and For Your Eyes Only. After snooping some more on Stromberg's lab and defeating some bad guys, Bond and Anya emerge to the startled reactions of a beach full of tourists. Obviously, this is terrible spy work, and the fact that a fish somehow got into the car is really silly, and yeah, I think it works. There are just the right amount of double takes and reaction shots and animals to make it okay. I know people might find this a bit too silly, but for me it's fine, and I'm just rolling with it. Back at the hotel, the horny as hell receptionist reappears to deliver a message from M, basically confirming that Bond is right to be suspicious about the model of a supertanker he saw in Stromberg's base. There's still some good banter here between Bond and Anya, and they're playing off each other really well. They're obviously very comfortable in each other's company, and so there's no better time for a bombshell to drop.
Very nice.
Oh, it's Austrian. I bought it in Berngarten.
Vangarten.
Yes, I was doing some skiing.
When was this?
About 3 weeks ago. Why?
Yes, it all comes out here that Bond was the one responsible for the death of Anya's partner. I think both actors play this scene incredibly well. I get self-contained rage from Anya, and Moore is perfectly judging the bluntness with which he has Bond respond to Anya's questioning, but there's just a tinge of sadness in his face. He's not going to admit or show regret, but for a man who we see kill others over and over, it's a more stark moment to have Bond reflecting on one particular kill like this, and really makes you think about the families and loved ones of all the various people that he's killed over the years. His actions have consequences, and yes, I'm very much aware of the pretty great scene from Austin Powers that makes fun of such a concept, but here the seriousness of the scene is perfectly judged. In the audio commentary for the film, director Lewis Gilbert talks about how this scene was actually shot over several days, and it was actually quite challenging for the actors to kind of get into the mindset of performing the scene when it's like chopped up over several days, and especially taking that into account, I think they do a tremendous job here. The scene ends with Anya vowing to kill Bond as revenge once their mission is over, which is a great dramatic way to end that particular scene, but it's sadly undercut 2 shots later by Moore's goofy smiling at her while they're being dropped off at an American nuclear sub, where we quickly meet Commander Carter, played by Shane Rimmer, in his largest Bond role, having also been in You and Live Twice and Diamonds Are Forever. Considering how his roles expand over the course of his 3 movies, I'm surprised they didn't just cast him as Bond in the next one. It's the turn of the men in the film to get super horny, apparently, as it seems everyone is bowled over by the presence of Anya aboard the submarine, and even the submarine itself seems to be erecting itself in one of the shots that follows Carter and Anya's first encounter.
You do not have to show me any special favors, Commander.
All the same, I think it might be better if I did.
Anyway, Bond and Anya are receiving assistance from the US Navy in locating the Laparis, a massive tanker under the command of Stromberg. They succeed in this and are about to torpedo the tanker when all hell breaks loose, and, similar to the subs from the start of the film, the US vessel is paralysed and taken in by the Laparis. More fantastic model work and special effects during this sequence. The music is super ominous too, and don't get me started on how incredible this interior set for the Laparis is. I left this thing off my best villains bases list a while back, and I really kicked myself over that coming back to the film and watching it now. Of course, this was the famous set that was so big that they had to build a soundstage around it. There wasn't a soundstage big enough to build this thing in, so they had to make their own. And while the exterior design of the base obviously doesn't compare with that of Atlantis, which I think is super beautiful, the interior of the Laparis is just superb and some of production designer Ken Adams' best work on the series. And at this point, I suppose we should probably talk about the clear parallels this movie has to You and Live Twice. This film, that film, and Moonraker are often cited as being the monorail trilogy of Bond films, and while each film does undoubtedly share similar villains with similarly grand world-changing schemes, all involving the hijacking or capturing of vehicles, I think it's somewhat unfair, actually, to say that they're essentially remakes of one another. Each of the 3 does have their own unique set of elements to bring to the table, so while in the broad strokes they may be very similar, I think each film does have its own identity, and they are very different in a lot of ways, and all 3 happen to be favourites of mine in the series, which should tell you all you need to know about my taste in Bond movies. Anyway, the Americans, Bond and Anya, are captured, and the latter 2 receive a private audience with Stromberg after trying to blend in with the crowd, despite wearing different naval uniforms to everybody else, but this nonetheless gives the villain a good opportunity to exposit information about his dastardly plan, which is to launch 2 nuclear submarines into the ocean and have them fire at New York and Moscow, and assume that the preceding conflict would destroy the world and mean that he can capitalize on the situation and launch his new world order under the sea.
I intend to change the face of history.
By destroying the world?
By creating a world. A new and beautiful world beneath the sea.
Under the sea. No. Not going there. I'm not entirely sure how Stromberg hopes to cajole the people of a post-apocalyptic world to live life underneath the ocean. I guess he'll just be rounding up the heavily radiated survivors and assuming they'll jump at the chance to spend the rest of their days in his underwater condominiums. Presumably everyone on his staff is totally down with this too, unless some of them are hearing it now for the first time and having second thoughts.
A new and beautiful world beneath the sea. Today's civilization...
Here, John, did you hear that? What was that he said about under the sea? Stromberg's motivation is one of the weakest Bond villain motivations in the entire series, I think. The fact that he thinks society is decadent, and he thinks that everything would just be better if people moved Under the Sea? I mean, it's in the novelization, they go kind of one step further with Stromberg just admitting that his motivation is just to destroy the world. He wants to destroy the world, and I think that works better with him just flat out calling that out instead of this whole sort of like under the sea society thing, which is just really odd. But hey, you know what? This is a big, grandiose Bond adventure. If I'm having fun, I'm not gonna get hung up on the villain's plan being, you know, not making all that much sense, and I'm having so much fun here. I'm fully going with it. Despite the fun I'm having in general, though, Kurt-Jürgen Stromberg has never been a favourite villain of mine. Not to say that he does a bad job here by any means. I mean, he is a good actor and he plays this part convincingly. He's just very unmemorable, and he falls into the category of insane, mega-rich, industrialist Bond villains, and when you look at other members of that tier of villainy, it's full of more colourful, eccentric characters, and he just kind of fades into the background a bit. Like I say, it's not that he's a bad actor or it's a badly written part or anything like that, and in moments he really does get that kind of insane fire in his eyes and I believe him in the role, but he's just not fun to watch like Goldfinger or Max Zorin are, for example. Stromberg saunters off back to Atlantis, but decides to take Anya with him for some reason. I guess he just takes a fancy to her and envisions her as his underwater mole or something. In some pretty poor model work, the pair jet off, and unfortunately this means that Anya is out of the film, pretty much, and really just ends up being a damsel to be rescued at the very end. Stromberg even dresses her up in a pretty dress and ties her to a chair to do something to, I guess, bore her to death talking about his marine wildlife collection. A shame, as the character had an awful lot more potential than that, and I think that they do the whole female counterpart thing with Bond much better in the next film, but we'll get to Dr. Holly Goodhead then. The stage is set for the biggest action of the film as Bond escapes and unleashes an army of seamen to storm the base. I love some of the extras in these scenes, particularly these two who are all like, "What's going on? What's happening?" "I don't know, mate. Just follow everybody else." The operations room is sealed, and all the action becomes revolved around getting in there to stop the subs before they can fire on the cities. This is one of the biggest battles in all of Bond, quite possibly the biggest in terms of just like scale and number of extras. It's a bit of a bloodbath, and I've heard complaints that this kind of massive finale isn't terribly appropriate for Bond. It's easy for him to get lost in the literally hundreds of characters we're seeing on screen. There's even a bit where a young man suddenly hijacks the film and we're following him for a little while, and I just love the look on Bond's face. "Whose bloody film do you think this is? I didn't see young man as Ian Fleming's naval bit part at the start of the credits, did you?" But he is quickly offed as it becomes clear that the control room is damn near impregnable. Bond gets the idea to use the detonator from a nuclear missile to blast through, and we have a pair of really great suspenseful scenes here, particularly when Bond is trying to get the detonator out of the missile without setting it off. Bond often has tense moments defusing bombs and the like, and this is probably my favourite of those moments. Similarly, I love the bit where he gets stuck and he needs to get away before the explosion goes off. I think Roger is really great here, just overall, actually. His performance is perfectly pitched, probably his best as Bond, and I'd go so far as to say overall one of the best Bond performances of any actor of the entire series with this film. He does the humour, the suspense, the action, everything just so well for the kind of movie they're making here. Obviously, he's not going to win an Oscar for his work in this film, and he doesn't really have any, you know, big, dramatic, weighty scenes to play, but I think it's quite something to lead a film like this that could just be dismissed as a bit of fluffy entertainment, to lead a film like this with good humour and believability and hitting all the necessary emotional beats when he's required to. I think he does a fantastic job in this film, and he's a severely underrated actor. As if to undercut all of my praising, now we come to the moment that has probably aged the worst in the entire film, when Bond and the good guys take over the control room and Bond has to literally read a how-to manual to use the tracking system. It's silly, but, you know, I actually quite like it, really. So often in these films, Bond just immediately knows and can do everything, so it's quite refreshing to see him come up against something and be like, instructions first, maybe. I do have flashbacks to teaching my nan how to use an iPhone, though, when I see this scene. Roger really captures the technologically challenged relative look really well here. Anyway, more great tension as the missiles are fired and the targets are changed to the other submarines, so they end up destroying each other. Lovely moment when the missiles just barely miss each other on the globe screen. It's really cool. Conveniently, Fortunately, this all happens just in time for the Laparis to start blowing up from the inside out. Of course, our heroes escape though, and the Laparis goes the way of the Titanic. You might be forgiven for thinking that this is actually the end of the film, and Bond will have to make do with Captain Carter for his final shag of the film, but no, Stromberg and Jaws are still alive and Anya needs to be rescued. There's a good ticking clock element to the finale as Carter has instructions to sink Atlantis almost immediately, so Bond has only a few minutes to make his rescue. More great performance stuff from Moore here as he is defiant that he's going to rescue Anya.
There's Anya on there.
I know, James. I'm sorry.
I have to get her off.
This obviously carries extra dramatic weight with it too, given that Anya has vowed to kill Bond once their mission is over, and yet even despite that, he doesn't even think about it. He's like, nope, I'm gonna go save her, and I like that. It shows how much he really does care about her, and how he's just absolutely not gonna let her sink along with the villains. Bond heads to Atlantis on a wet bike. I wish they'd have dolled this thing up a bit more to make it look more appropriate and less like something that Bond won on a TV game show, but whatever. Bond arrives and promptly enters Stromberg's lift, but ho-ho, it's a trap as Stromberg boots up his Shark-O-Vision with some really inappropriate music.
Goodbye, Mr. Bond.
Sounds kind of like the shark is building up to a striptease. But Bond, of course, is too clever for such a plan, and we get a little showdown with Stromberg, which is actually a bit of a disappointing climax. Stromberg has an under-the-table weapon that Bond shoots down, which presumably means that Stromberg gets hit in his groin here, which is pretty brutal, but then Bond gets up and shoots him twice more in the chest. It's kind of impactful and kind of boring at the same time. Like, I like that it's a really cold kill, but it's so weirdly presented. Normally when villains get their comeuppance, there's one, like, cathartic, moment where the villain dies, and yet here it's kind of oddly prolonged and drawn out. More entertaining is the final fight with Jaws, which of course spills over into the shark room so we can have a Jaws versus Jaws showdown. I guess it's a bit of friendly box office banter. The film is essentially saying, well, you thought that fish from that other movie you saw a couple of years ago was bad. Well, look at this guy. He can beat a shark, but magnets? Well, that's a little bit trickier for him. Bond rescues Anya, still tied up in Stromberg's reception room, which is a really cool set, by the way. I haven't mentioned it yet, and I wish that more happened in this room. I love how Stromberg just left her tied up there, like, presumably went and got changed in order to have dinner, like, what was his plan for her? Anyway, Anya proves to be completely useless in the escape from Atlantis once the Americans torpedo the place. Some excellent model work and water effects here. Particularly enjoy the shots of the actors looking genuinely terrified. Roger Moore even eyes the camera at one point like, how many more of these am I contracted for again? He even just buggers off and leaves Anya to flail around in the water some more. He should really have taken a ticket out of General Gogol and M's book here and have the courtesy to let her go before him, but never mind. The escape Atlantis in Stromberg's 1% emergency pod, and we have the climax of the pair's relationship here. Anya has the option of killing Bond, and yet chooses not to, instead deciding to get off with him instead. Meanwhile, Jaws appears alive and swims off into the next film. Anyway, things wrap up with a bunch of dignitaries assembling to greet Bond and Anya, who forego any kind of embarrassment and instead just pull down the curtain and carry on getting jiggy with it to a really bawdy version of the main title song.
007, Triple X. Bond, what do you think you're doing?
Keeping the British end up, sir.
Nobody does it better.
I'd be lying if I said hearing this did not make me want to put on a top hat, grab a cane, and descend down some stairs, but it is a really odd note to end on, and the music just has a kind of bawdy, end-of-pier quality to it that just kind of tonally doesn't gel with the rest of the film at all. I'd also love to know what happened next. Like, did everyone just leave them to it? I do love this extra in the background who folds his arm and steps forward for a better look like, well, 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 what have we here? So that's the end of The Spy Who Loved Me. God-tier Bond and all-around crowd pleaser, I'd say. I was actually a bit apprehensive coming back to this one. For the longest time, Spy Who Loved Me was hailed as Roger's best, and up there with Goldfinger and GoldenEye as some of the higher esteemed movies in the series. I feel like that's actually shifted a bit recently in favour of For Your Eyes Only, and I was actually nervous, being the first time that I've watched this film in a long time, that I wouldn't have as good a time with Spy as I did. But really, I just absolutely adore this film. It was totally the right move to bring Lewis Gilbert back as director. With his 3 Bond films, I think think he proves that he's the daddy of the huge extravaganza 007 movies, and this is his best without a doubt. I have a lot of time for the previous film, The Man with the Golden Gun, but it was right to bring back and bring in some new perspectives for Bond's relaunch. Things feel fresh and new again. Roger from this point on is very consistently excellent as James Bond, but this is probably his best performance in the role. He's smooth, cool, doing the action bits along with the comedy stuff really well, and even the more heartfelt and tense moments they throw at him. He's tremendously good in this film. As I said earlier on, Barbara Bach is, I think, perfectly good as Anya Amasova. I just think that the voice looping lets her down, and there was more potential for this character in concept. It sucks that after all the fun interplay and one-upmanship, she just ends up being tied to a chair needing to be rescued. It's a weak ending for a strong character, but like I say, they improve on this type of character in the next film. On the villain's side, Kurt-Jürgen Stromberg is pretty much definition mid-tier Bond villain, I think. I can't imagine anyone disliking him passionately or liking him passionately. He kind of works in the film, I suppose, but I don't think he's going to be inspiring any fan art anytime soon. Maybe that doesn't matter, though, because Richard Kiel as Jaws is a scene-stealing fan favourite and one of the truly iconic bunch of Bond henchmen. I love everything that he does in this film, from the genuinely scary, unsettling moments to the more comedic bits. He does it all so perfectly. Pacing-wise, the film's really well judged. It's just the right amount of action when there needs to be, and the dialogue is good, and the tension and one-upmanship between the two stars provides their relationship with a unique flavour. The story undoubtedly has some lazy moments and things that don't quite make sense, but it's one of those things where if everything else is working so well, it doesn't matter as much. You're willing to give it a pass because you're being so entertained, and The Spy Who Loved Me provides some special escapist entertainment. I love getting lost in the world of this film, and particularly with the current state of the world, I think I may have just loved getting lost in this more than I ever have. One of the very best Bond films and a tremendous bit of fun. That is it for this time, Bond fans. Next up in this in-depth movie review series will, of course, be Moonraker, a Bond film that I may be more than slightly biased towards, but we'll get more into that next time. In the meantime, if you've made it to the very end of this very long video review, thank you so much, and please do let me know your thoughts on the movie in the comments section below. It's always good to get a good discussion going there, and if you haven't already, please do hit the subscribe button to subscribe to this channel and stay up to date with future video uploads. Also below you can find links to my various social media pages. There is my Facebook page and my Twitter page, and then there is my Patreon page for those of you who really like this channel and want to go one extra step in supporting it and giving me the drive to spend an hour talking about each of these Bond films in turn. Until next time, Bond fans, so long for now.